The revelation came through the most devastating vision Jesus had ever shown me, a glimpse of the moments immediately after the rapture, when millions of Christians who thought they were ready discovered they had been left behind. But what Jesus revealed about why they missed it will wake you up to a truth the church desperately needs to hear. And by the end of this account, you'll understand why the reason Christians miss the rapture has nothing to do with what most believers think determines who goes up. It started with a dream that felt more real than waking life. I found myself standing in a church sanctuary on what appeared to be a normal Sunday morning, but something was terribly wrong. The building was half empty, and those who remained were in various states of shock, confusion, and growing panic. What I witnessed in that sanctuary would haunt me for weeks, but it was nothing compared to what Jesus would reveal about why these believers had been left behind. At the front of the church, behind the pulpit, stood Margaret Williams, a woman I had known for over 20 years. She had taught Sunday school for 3 decades, served on the missions committee, and was considered one of the most faithful members of her congregation. But now she stood frozen, staring at the empty chairs where her husband and 2 of her 3 children had been sitting just moments before. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stunned silence. "How are they gone? I've been a Christian longer than any of them. I've served God faithfully for 30 years. How could they be taken and not me?" Margaret's question would become the key to understanding Jesus' shocking revelation about why some Christians miss the rapture. Around the sanctuary, similar scenes were playing out. The head deacon sat in his usual pew, but his wife's purse remained in the empty seat beside him. The choir director stood alone at the piano, her teenage daughter's music folder still open on the bench. The associate pastor paced behind the pulpit, his phone pressed to his ear as he desperately tried to call his wife, who had apparently vanished from the church nursery along with half the children. But what made this vision so disturbing wasn't just who was gone, it was who remained. These weren't nominal Christians or backslidden believers. These were active, committed church members who had dedicated their lives to serving God. They knew their Bibles, attended services regularly, tithed faithfully, and lived moral lives. By every standard the church taught, they should have been among the first to go. The answer to why they remained would challenge everything I thought I knew about salvation and readiness. I woke from the dream with my heart pounding and my mind racing. The images were so vivid, so real, that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a glimpse of an actual future event. But more disturbing than the vision itself was the question it raised. If faithful, committed Christians could miss the rapture, what determined who went and who stayed? Over the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Williams and the others I had seen left behind. These weren't people who had rejected Christ or abandoned their faith. They were sincere believers who had spent decades serving God, yet somehow they had missed the most important event in Christian history. 3 weeks after the dream, Jesus would appear to answer the question that was consuming my thoughts. That night, as I sat in my study, wrestling with the implications of what I had seen, I found myself on my knees in desperate prayer. "Lord," I whispered, "I need to understand what I saw. If faithful Christians can miss the rapture, then everything I've been taught about who goes up might be wrong. Please show me the truth." The study grew quiet in that familiar way that preceded Jesus' appearances, but this time there was something different in the atmosphere, a weight of eternal significance that made my heart race with both anticipation and fear. What Jesus revealed when he appeared would shatter every assumption I had about why some Christians miss the rapture. Suddenly, my study filled with that familiar presence, and Jesus was sitting in the chair across from my desk. But his expression was unlike anything I had seen in our previous encounters, not anger or disappointment, but a profound sadness that seemed to carry the weight of countless lost opportunities. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both infinite compassion and heartbreaking sorrow, "what you saw in your dream was not just a possibility, it's a certainty. When the rapture occurs, millions of sincere Christians will be left behind, and their confusion will be as great as their devastation. But the reason Jesus gave for why they would miss it was more shocking than I could have imagined. The question you're wrestling with," Jesus continued, "is the same question they will ask in that moment. How could faithful Christians miss the rapture? Tonight, I'm going to show you the answer, and I promise you, it will wake you up to a truth that could save countless believers from that devastating experience." Before I could respond, my study around us dissolved. We were back in that church sanctuary, but now I could see not just what had happened, but why it had happened. Jesus was revealing the spiritual condition of each person who had been left behind. What he showed me about Margaret Williams would become the key to understanding everything. "Look at Margaret," Jesus said, directing my attention to the Sunday school teacher who stood frozen in shock. "For 30 years, she has served faithfully in this church. She knows her Bible, teaches children about my love, and lives a moral life. By every external measure, she appears to be a committed Christian." But look deeper, Jesus continued, and suddenly I could see into Margaret's heart in a way that was both revealing and heartbreaking. What I saw in Margaret's heart would explain why faithful service wasn't enough to guarantee rapture readiness. Despite her decades of faithful service, Margaret's heart revealed a woman who had never truly surrendered her life to Christ. She had accepted him as Savior, served him as Lord in the areas that were comfortable for her, but had never allowed him to transform the deepest parts of her soul. "Margaret loves me," Jesus explained, "but she has never learned to love what I love. She serves me faithfully, but she has never aligned her heart with my heart. She knows about me, but she doesn't truly know me." The specific areas Jesus revealed would show why knowledge and service weren't enough. I watched as Jesus revealed the hidden areas of Margaret's life that she had never surrendered to him, her prejudices that she had never allowed him to change, her priorities that remained focused on earthly success rather than kingdom purposes, her relationships that she managed through human wisdom rather than divine love. "She has been a faithful church member," Jesus said, "but she has never become a true disciple. She has served me in the areas that felt natural to her, but she has resisted the transformation that would make her truly ready." But Margaret's situation was just the beginning of what Jesus would reveal. The shocking truth, Jesus explained, is that the rapture is not about rescuing church members, it's about taking disciples home. It's not about rewarding faithful service, it's about completing spiritual transformation. As the vision expanded, I could see the spiritual condition of every person who had been left behind. The deacon who had served faithfully but had never learned to forgive his estranged brother. The choir director who had led worship for years but had never surrendered her pride and need for recognition. The associate pastor who had preached about love but had never dealt with the bitterness in his own heart. Each case revealed the same shocking pattern. "These believers," Jesus said, "have all accepted me as Savior, and they will all spend eternity in heaven, but they have never allowed me to complete the work of transformation that true discipleship requires. They have remained spiritual infants rather than growing into spiritual maturity." The distinction Jesus was making would challenge everything I thought I knew about salvation and readiness. The rapture, Jesus explained, is not about salvation, it's about transformation. It's not about who has prayed a prayer, it's about who has allowed that prayer to change their life. Many who are saved are not ready because they have never moved beyond spiritual infancy. I began to understand that Jesus was revealing a distinction between salvation and discipleship that most churches never taught. These believers were genuinely saved, their names were written in the book of life, and they would spend eternity with God, but they had never developed the spiritual maturity that rapture readiness required. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The reason these Christians missed the rapture, Jesus said, his voice taking on an intensity that made the spiritual atmosphere around us seem to vibrate, is not because they aren't saved, it's because they aren't ready. They have accepted my gift of salvation, but they have never embraced my call to transformation. What Jesus revealed next would explain why this distinction was so crucial. The rapture, Jesus continued, is designed to take those who are ready for heaven, not just those who are going to heaven. It's about spiritual maturity, not just spiritual birth. It's about disciples who have learned to live as citizens of my kingdom, not just believers who have secured their place in my kingdom. As the vision continued, I could see how this principle played out in the lives of those who had been taken versus those who had been left behind. Those who went up had learned to surrender every area of their lives to Christ's lordship. Those who remained had accepted his salvation but had never allowed him to complete his transforming work in their hearts. The implications of what Jesus was revealing were staggering. This is why, Jesus explained, faithful church attendance, biblical knowledge, and religious service are not enough to guarantee rapture readiness. These things are good, but they can exist without the heart transformation that true discipleship produces. I watched as Jesus showed me believer after believer who had spent years in church, learned extensive biblical knowledge, and served faithfully, but had never allowed Christ to transform their character, their priorities, or their deepest motivations. Tomorrow night, Jesus would reveal the specific areas where Christians resist transformation. As the vision began to fade and my study gradually reappeared around us, Jesus leaned forward with an expression that mixed infinite love with urgent concern. "Jonathan," he said, "what you've seen tonight is not meant to create fear, it's meant to create awakening. Millions of Christians are living in a dangerous assumption that salvation automatically equals readiness. Tomorrow night," he continued, "I'll show you the specific areas where believers resist the transformation that readiness requires and why they choose spiritual comfort over spiritual growth." But before he left, Jesus gave me a warning that would haunt me until our next encounter. "The tragedy," Jesus said as his presence began to fade, "is not that these believers will miss heaven, they won't. The tragedy is that they will miss the rapture because they chose to remain spiritual infants rather than growing into the spiritual maturity that readiness requires." As his presence faded completely, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. "Tell them that salvation is about what I've done for them. Readiness is about what I want to do in them. And many who have received the first have never allowed the second." What Jesus would reveal the next night about the specific areas of resistance would explain why so many Christians remain spiritually immature. And then I was alone in my study, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumption that all Christians would be raptured lay in ruins around me. According to Jesus, the rapture was about transformation, not just salvation, about discipleship, not just church membership. Margaret Williams and the others I had seen left behind weren't lost, they were saved believers who would spend eternity in heaven. But they had missed the rapture because they had never allowed Christ to complete the transforming work that true discipleship required. The question that remained was, what specific areas of transformation do Christians resist, and why do they choose spiritual comfort over spiritual growth? That answer would come tomorrow night. The second night brought revelations that exposed the specific ways Christians sabotage their own spiritual growth and miss the transformation that rapture readiness requires. After Jesus revealed that faithful believers could miss the rapture due to spiritual immaturity, I spent the entire day examining my own life for areas where I might be resisting his transforming work. But what Jesus showed me about the specific areas where Christians resist transformation would prove more convicting than anything I had ever encountered. As I entered my study that evening, I felt a weight of anticipation mixed with apprehension. The distinction Jesus had drawn between salvation and readiness had shaken me to my core, and I knew that what he would reveal tonight would be even more challenging. The familiar presence filled the room, and Jesus appeared with an expression that combined infinite patience with holy urgency. There was something in his eyes that reminded me of his words about the narrow gate and the difficulty of the path that leads to life. The first area of resistance Jesus revealed would immediately challenge my assumptions about spiritual maturity. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both tender compassion and unwavering truth, "tonight I'm going to show you the specific areas where Christians resist the transformation that readiness requires. These areas of resistance are so common that most believers don't even recognize them as obstacles to spiritual growth." Before I could respond, my study dissolved around us. We were observing what appeared to be the most intimate view of believers' spiritual lives I had ever witnessed. Not their external religious activities, but their internal resistance to Christ's transforming work. What Jesus showed me first would explain why so many Christians remain spiritually stagnant despite years of church involvement. The first area of resistance, Jesus said, is what I call selective surrender. These believers have given me control over the areas of their lives that feel safe or natural, but they resist my lordship in areas that would require significant change or sacrifice. I watched as this pattern played out in the lives of countless Christians I recognized from churches across the country. Believers who had surrendered their Sunday mornings to God but not their Monday through Saturday priorities. Christians who had given him their tithe but not their spending habits. Church members who had submitted to his moral standards but not to his call for radical love and forgiveness. The specific example Jesus showed me was particularly convicting. "Look at this elder," Jesus said, directing my attention to a man I recognized as a respected church leader. He has served faithfully for 20 years, teaches a Bible study, and is considered one of the most mature believers in his congregation. But as Jesus revealed the man's heart, I saw someone who had never allowed Christ to transform his business practices, his treatment of employees, or his response to those who disagreed with him. He had accepted Christ's salvation and submitted to his lordship in religious matters, but had kept entire areas of his life off limits to transformation. The second area of resistance would prove even more widespread. The second area, Jesus continued, is comfortable Christianity. These believers have found a level of spiritual growth that feels satisfying and safe, and they resist any call to move beyond that comfort zone. What Jesus showed me next was both revealing and disturbing. I watched as Christians who had achieved a certain level of biblical knowledge, spiritual discipline, and religious involvement became satisfied with their progress and stopped pursuing deeper transformation. One particular case Jesus showed me was especially eye-opening. "Observe this woman," Jesus said, showing me someone I recognized as a longtime Sunday school teacher and Bible study leader. She has been a Christian for 30 years, knows her Bible well, and is respected for her spiritual maturity. But, as Jesus revealed her spiritual condition, I saw someone who had stopped growing years ago. She had reached a level of knowledge and practice that felt comfortable and had unconsciously decided that she had arrived spiritually. She was no longer hungry for transformation because she was satisfied with her current level of spiritual development. The third area of resistance would prove to be the most subtle and dangerous. The third area, Jesus said, his voice taking on a tone of particular concern, is performance-based spirituality. These believers have learned to measure their spiritual condition by their religious activities rather than by their heart transformation. I watched as this pattern revealed itself in church after church. Christians who equated spiritual maturity with biblical knowledge, church attendance, and religious service, but who had never allowed Christ to transform their character, their motivations, or their deepest attitudes. The example Jesus showed me would challenge everything I thought I knew about spiritual growth. "Look at this deacon," Jesus said, showing me a man who was known throughout his church for his dedication and service. He attends every service, serves on multiple committees, and gives generously to the church. But as Jesus revealed the man's heart, I saw someone whose identity was built on his religious performance rather than on his relationship with Christ. He measured his spiritual condition by his activities rather than by his transformation, and he had unconsciously substituted religious busyness for spiritual growth. The fourth area of resistance would prove to be particularly prevalent among church leaders. The fourth area, Jesus continued, is ministry substitution. These believers have become so focused on serving me that they have neglected the personal transformation that effective ministry requires. What Jesus revealed next was both shocking and heartbreaking. I watched as pastors, teachers, and church leaders who were dedicated to serving God had unconsciously substituted ministry activity for personal spiritual growth. They were so busy helping others grow spiritually that they had stopped growing themselves. One specific case Jesus showed me was particularly tragic. "Observe this, pastor," Jesus said, directing my attention to a man I recognized as the leader of a large, successful church. He preaches powerful sermons, leads a growing congregation, and is respected throughout his denomination. But as Jesus revealed the pastor's spiritual condition, I saw someone who had been so consumed with building his ministry that he had neglected his own relationship with Christ. He could teach others about transformation, but he had stopped experiencing it himself. The fifth area of resistance would prove to be the most heartbreaking. The fifth area, Jesus said, his voice now carrying a weight of infinite sadness, is wounded withdrawal. These believers have experienced hurt, disappointment, or betrayal, and they have unconsciously closed off parts of their hearts to protect themselves from further pain. I watched as this pattern revealed itself in the lives of countless Christians who had been wounded by other believers, disappointed by unanswered prayers, or hurt by life circumstances. Instead of allowing Christ to heal and transform their pain, they had built walls around their hearts that also kept out his transforming love. The example Jesus showed me would explain why so many Christians remain emotionally and spiritually stunted. "Look at this woman," Jesus said, showing me someone I recognized as a faithful church member who had experienced significant betrayal and loss. She continues to attend church, serve faithfully, and maintain her Christian witness. But as Jesus revealed her heart, I saw someone who had unconsciously decided that it was safer to keep Christ at arm's length than to risk the vulnerability that deep transformation required. She had accepted his salvation but had closed off the areas of her heart that needed his healing touch. As Jesus continued to reveal these areas of resistance, a shocking pattern began to emerge. The tragic truth, Jesus explained, is that each of these areas of resistance feels like wisdom to those who practice them. Selective surrender feels like balance. Comfortable Christianity feels like maturity. Performance-based spirituality feels like faithfulness. Ministry substitution feels like dedication. Wounded withdrawal feels like protection. I began to understand why so many sincere Christians remained spiritually immature despite years of church involvement. They had unconsciously chosen forms of resistance that felt like spiritual wisdom, never realizing that they were sabotaging their own growth. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The reason these areas of resistance are so dangerous, Jesus said, is that they allow believers to feel spiritually satisfied while remaining spiritually immature. They create the illusion of growth while preventing the reality of transformation. What Jesus showed me next was the most convicting truth I had ever encountered about Christian spiritual development. I watched as believers who practiced these forms of resistance became increasingly satisfied with their spiritual condition, while becoming increasingly resistant to the deeper work that Christ wanted to do in their hearts. The long-term effects of this resistance would prove devastating. Over time, Jesus explained, these believers develop what I call spiritual arthritis, a gradual stiffening of the heart that makes transformation increasingly difficult. They become set in their ways, satisfied with their progress, and resistant to change. I watched as this spiritual arthritis played out in the lives of longtime Christians who had become so comfortable with their current level of spiritual development that they could no longer hear Christ's call to deeper transformation. They had not rejected him, but they had stopped responding to him. Tomorrow night, Jesus would reveal how Christians could overcome these areas of resistance. As the vision began to fade and my study gradually reappeared around us, Jesus leaned forward with an expression that mixed infinite love with urgent concern. "Jonathan," he said, "what you've seen tonight explains why so many sincere Christians will miss the rapture. They have accepted my salvation but have resisted my transformation. They are saved, but they are not ready. Tomorrow night," he continued, "I'll show you how any believer can overcome these areas of resistance and experience the transformation that readiness requires." But before he left, Jesus gave me a warning that would change how I understood spiritual growth forever. "The tragedy," Jesus said as his presence began to fade, "is not that these believers don't love me, they do. The tragedy is that they have unconsciously chosen comfort over transformation, safety over growth, and satisfaction over surrender." As his presence faded completely, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. "Tell them that the greatest enemy of spiritual transformation is not rebellion, it's satisfaction. Tell them that feeling spiritually mature can be the greatest obstacle to becoming spiritually mature." What Jesus would reveal the next night about overcoming resistance would provide hope for every believer willing to pursue true transformation. And then I was alone in my study, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumption that spiritual activity equals spiritual maturity lay in ruins around me. According to Jesus, millions of sincere Christians were unconsciously resisting the very transformation that would make them rapture ready. The 5 areas of resistance: selective surrender, comfortable Christianity, performance-based spirituality, ministry substitution, and wounded withdrawal were so common and so subtle that most believers didn't even recognize them as obstacles to growth. But the most important question remained: how could Christians overcome these areas of resistance and experience the transformation that readiness required? That answer would come tomorrow night. The third night brought the most hope-filled revelation about spiritual transformation I had ever received. After Jesus revealed the specific areas where Christians resist his transforming work, I spent the entire day examining my own heart for these patterns of resistance. What he would show me about overcoming them would revolutionize my understanding of how believers could move from spiritual infancy to the maturity that rapture readiness requires. But what Jesus revealed about the path to transformation would prove both more challenging and more achievable than I could have imagined. As I entered my study that final evening, I felt a mixture of anticipation and determination unlike anything I had experienced in my previous encounters with Jesus. The weight of understanding why Christians miss the rapture had been pressing on my heart, but tonight I would learn how they could avoid that devastating experience. The familiar presence filled the room, and Jesus appeared with an expression that radiated both infinite hope and transforming power. There was something different about his demeanor tonight, a sense of eager anticipation, as if he was about to reveal the solution to a problem that had been breaking his heart. The first step Jesus revealed would immediately challenge how I understood spiritual growth. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both tender encouragement and holy authority, "tonight I'm going to show you how any believer can overcome the areas of resistance that prevent transformation and experience the spiritual maturity that rapture readiness requires. The path I'm about to reveal is available to every Christian, regardless of how long they've been stuck in spiritual immaturity." Before I could respond, my study dissolved around us. But this time, instead of observing resistance and immaturity, we were witnessing the most beautiful transformations I had ever seen. Believers who had broken through their areas of resistance and experienced the radical change that Christ desired for their lives. What Jesus showed me first would revolutionize my understanding of how transformation actually occurs. The first step to overcoming resistance, Jesus said, is what I call holy dissatisfaction. Believers must recognize that their current level of spiritual development is inadequate for what I'm calling claimed them to become. I watched as this holy dissatisfaction awakened in the hearts of Christians who had been comfortable with their spiritual condition. It wasn't condemnation or shame, it was a divine discontent that created hunger for something deeper, something more transformative than what they had previously experienced. The specific example Jesus showed me was both convicting and inspiring. "Look at this elder," Jesus said, directing my attention to the same man who had practiced selective surrender in the previous vision. For years, he was satisfied with giving me control over his religious life while keeping his business practices and personal relationships off limits to my lordship. But now I watched as the Holy Spirit awakened in him a recognition that his compartmentalized Christianity was preventing him from experiencing the fullness of what Christ offered. Instead of feeling condemned, he felt hungry for the complete transformation that he had been unconsciously avoiding. The second step would prove even more crucial. The second step, Jesus continued, is radical honesty. Believers must be willing to examine their hearts without the filters of self-justification, comparison to others, or religious performance. What Jesus showed me next was both humbling and liberating. I watched as Christians began to honestly assess their spiritual condition, not compared to other believers or measured by their religious activities, but evaluated against the standard of Christ's character and calling. One particular transformation Jesus showed me was especially powerful. "Observe this woman," Jesus said, showing me the Sunday school teacher who had been practicing comfortable Christianity. She had been satisfied with her level of biblical knowledge and spiritual discipline for years. But now I watched as she began to honestly examine her heart and discovered areas of pride, unforgiveness, and spiritual complacency that she had never acknowledged. Instead of defending these areas or making excuses, she faced them with the radical honesty that transformation required. The third step would prove to be the most challenging. "The third step," Jesus said, his voice taking on an intensity that made the spiritual atmosphere around us seem to vibrate with transforming power, "is complete surrender. This means giving me access to every area of their lives, including the areas they've been protecting or avoiding." I watched as this complete surrender played out in the lives of believers who had been practicing various forms of resistance. It wasn't a one-time decision, but an ongoing choice to submit every thought, every relationship, every priority, and every fear to Christ's transforming lordship. The example Jesus showed me would demonstrate why this step was so crucial. "Look at this deacon," Jesus said, showing me the man who had been practicing performance-based spirituality. He had built his identity on his religious activities rather than on his relationship with me. But now I watched as he made the terrifying but liberating choice to surrender his need for recognition, his pride in his service, and his identity as a good Christian to allow Christ to rebuild his spiritual foundation on relationship rather than performance. The fourth step would prove to be the most transformative. The fourth step, Jesus continued, is patient persistence. Transformation is not an event, but a process, and believers must be willing to pursue it consistently, even when progress seems slow or difficult. What Jesus revealed next gave me hope for every believer who had ever felt stuck in spiritual immaturity. I watched as Christians who had begun the transformation process learned to persist through seasons of difficulty, setbacks, and apparent lack of progress. One specific case Jesus showed me was particularly encouraging. "Observe this pastor," Jesus said, showing me the ministry leader who had been substituting service for personal growth. He had been so busy helping others grow spiritually that he had neglected his own transformation. But now I watched as he learned to balance ministry effectiveness with personal spiritual development, understanding that his own transformation was not separate from his ministry but essential to it. He persisted through the difficult process of changing lifelong patterns while continuing to serve others. The fifth step would prove to be the most beautiful. The fifth step, Jesus said, his voice now filled with infinite joy and anticipation, is transformational community. Believers cannot complete this journey alone. They need relationships with others who are also pursuing radical transformation. I watched as Christians who had been isolated in their spiritual journey found others who shared their hunger for deeper transformation. These weren't just accountability relationships or Bible study groups. They were communities of believers who were committed to helping each other become everything Christ called them to be. The example Jesus showed me would demonstrate the power of transformational community. "Look at this woman," Jesus said, showing me the believer who had been practicing wounded withdrawal. She had built walls around her heart to protect herself from further pain. But now I watched as she found a community of believers who created safety for her vulnerability and supported her through the difficult process of allowing Christ to heal and transform her deepest wounds. She didn't have to face her fears alone. She had others who were walking the same path of transformation. As Jesus showed me these 5 steps working together, the most beautiful truth began to emerge. When believers embrace these 5 steps, Jesus explained, they experience what I call accelerated transformation. Years of spiritual stagnation can be overcome in months when someone truly commits to this process. What Jesus showed me next filled me with hope for every Christian who had ever felt stuck in spiritual immaturity. I watched as believers who had been resistant to change for decades experienced rapid and profound transformation when they applied these 5 steps consistently. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The beautiful truth, Jesus said, is that this transformation is not just about rapture readiness, it's about experiencing the abundant life I came to give. Believers who pursue this path don't just become ready for heaven, they begin experiencing heaven on earth. I watched as transformed believers experience levels of joy, peace, purpose, and spiritual power that they had never imagined possible. Their transformation didn't just prepare them for the rapture, it revolutionized their daily experience of life with Christ. As the vision reached its climax, Jesus revealed the most important truth of all. "Right now," Jesus said, his presence filling the space around us with transforming light, any believer can begin this journey from spiritual immaturity to the transformation that readiness requires. The choice is available to every Christian regardless of how long they've been stuck or how resistant they've been to change. As the vision began to fade and my study gradually reappeared around us, Jesus leaned forward with an expression of infinite love and eager anticipation. Jesus' final words would provide both challenge and hope for every believer. "Jonathan," he said, "what you've seen tonight is not just information, it's an invitation. Every Christian who recognizes their need for deeper transformation can begin this journey today. The tragedy of believers missing the rapture," he continued, "is completely preventable. Any Christian willing to embrace holy dissatisfaction, radical honesty, complete surrender, patient persistence, and transformational community can experience the spiritual maturity that readiness requires." In that moment, the full weight of Jesus' revelation settled on my heart. The shocking truth about why Christians miss the rapture, Jesus said as his presence intensified rather than faded, is not that transformation is impossible, it's that they've chosen comfort over growth, satisfaction over surrender, and safety over transformation. As his presence filled my study with hope and transforming power, I realized this wasn't just a revelation about the rapture, it was an invitation to every believer to experience the abundant life that Christ came to give. Jesus' final words would change how I understood the purpose of spiritual transformation. Tell them, Jesus said, that the same transformation that makes them rapture-ready will also make them truly alive. Tell them that the path to readiness is also the path to the abundant life I promised. And tell them that this transformation is not just about avoiding being left behind, it's about experiencing everything I died to give them. As his presence finally began to fade, his last words burned themselves into my consciousness. The question is not whether transformation is possible, it's whether they want it enough to pursue it. And for those who do, I am ready to do more than they can ask or imagine. The shocking truth Jesus revealed would change everything about how I understood spiritual growth and rapture readiness. For months now, this revelation has revolutionized my understanding of why some Christians miss the rapture and how they can avoid that devastating experience. The reason believers get left behind has nothing to do with their salvation and everything to do with their transformation. The 5 areas of resistance: selective surrender, comfortable Christianity, performance-based spirituality, ministry substitution, and wounded withdrawal keep sincere Christians trapped in spiritual immaturity. But the 5 steps to transformation: holy dissatisfaction, radical honesty, complete surrender, patient persistence, and transformational community provide a clear path to the spiritual maturity that rapture readiness requires. The shocking truth is that missing the rapture is completely preventable. Any believer willing to pursue transformation can experience the spiritual growth that makes them ready. And that transformation doesn't just prepare them for the rapture, it gives them access to the abundant life that Christ came to provide. The choice is available to every Christian: remain comfortable in spiritual immaturity or pursue the transformation that leads to both rapture readiness and abundant life. The path is clear, the invitation is extended, and the power to change is available to all who truly want it.